From personal incentives to strive for online approval to the polarization of political discourse, digital technologies are actually changing how we form our identities. And that led straight into the 2019 conference theme, where we looked at borderlands. That conference was actually held on a border in between the USA and Mexico. So we had part of it in San Diego and part of it in Tijuana. And there we thought, what are identities if not borders? Kind of the ultimate borders, the thing that drives, fuels, and explains so many of the conflicts that we all work on. That year, we looked at how technologies both harden and bridge the social, political, and physical borders that shape conflict. And then came the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, at a conference that was supposed to take place in Cape Town, but ended up being an online event, we reflected that as peace builders, we need to pay attention to what the pandemic is doing to the fabric that keeps our societies together. What divisions are being exacerbated, and how does that shift the balance of power? In a nutshell, we reflected that social distancing means more of our lives are taking place online, and it's made it imperative that we dig a little deeper into understanding the socio-technical ecology, this evolving system we exist in, because it is changing how conflicts unfold and how we engage with conflict. I don't know how you were doing during the pandemic, but that year, as I worked, I kept asking myself, how much is it worth risking polarization and fragmentation in order to build a truly plural and inclusive society? How do we really balance this? How do we influence this balance in our socio-technical ecology? I actually kind of feel like we went through some kind of unveiling in 2020 in this respect, that somehow the pandemic made this socio-technical soup that we're swimming in so much more evident, and that so many more people are now talking about digital technologies and peace and conflict. Maybe that's why we stuck with a version of the same theme in 2021, reflecting on digital adaptations, digital conflict, and the long-term impacts of the pandemic on peace building and social justice. And I think this year we're still kind of in this multi-year reflection that started in 2018, unpacking how technology and innovation are changing conflict. If 2020 and 2021 are about the big shadows that the pandemic threw into the digital space, then 2022 is about all that goes unseen. Exploring the unseen is about dealing with the less visible sides of the digital and physical societal space, which are often overlooked through the emergence of dominant narratives amidst conflict. Our online and offline realities cannot be divorced from each other. We can look at them together to understand what unites us, what divides us, and how in between the cracks of those answers lies our capacity to respond to each other peacefully. We need to understand what lies below the surface together, hence exploring the unseen. One thing that often goes unseen, and that we've talked about before at Build Peace, is the dynamics that lead to supremacy and polarization. Physical and structural violence targeting specific groups or individuals, like the vile events in Chemnitz in 2018, are often the visible tip of the societal iceberg. But there are many unseen dynamics of supremacy and polarization that impact the way humans are able to connect within and between societal groups. I've personally been interested in how this plays out in online space for years. A lot of us here, I think, are thinking about disinformation and misinformation, right? So just so we're clear about the distinction, disinformation is creating and spreading incorrect information to intentionally deceive or manipulate others. Misinformation is spreading incorrect information without the intent to deceive. So most of disinformation is aimed at alienating a person or a group. In other words, disinformation uses some kind of a lie to close the debate, to simplify the narrative rather than allow for plurality. But then that lie spreads, and it becomes misinformation. Why? Why don't people just not spread misinformation? I think there are many possible answers to this question, and I know many speakers will be addressing it in different ways, but most answers seem to fall into two categories. One is that it's something to do with human neurology and behavior. Basically, our brains kind of love heuristic simplicity. The other is that it's something to do with the space in which we now communicate. Basically, misinformation spreads more because most digital technologies amplify this very human weakness of preferring simplicity. I think the second space about the digital space in which we communicate really worries me. Many of us have discussed how Meta, or more specifically Facebook, builds algorithms that maximize for quantity of engagement. So algorithms that want more of our attention on stuff, any stuff. Pushing polarizing content serves this attention extraction model. Lately, I've also started paying attention to how the same surveillance capitalism business model is actually financing people who produce disinformation content with their revenue from online ads, and mostly from Google ads. In 2019, the Global Disinformation Index said disinformation websites earned 250 million in ad revenue, and Google was responsible for 40% of those ads. By 2021, that amount had risen to 2.6 billion. Yeah. Stop for a moment to think about that figure. And the very fast rise, right? What's more, this is not an issue that's only affecting places like Myanmar or Brazil, which are the ones that get much more attention on the impact of misinformation on conflict and violence. I took the time to look up what is happening with German language websites, and the EU Disinfo Lab identified, so the 30 German language sites the EU Disinfo Lab identified as consistent sources of false information. More than 30% of them earn money from Google ads. Many of those sites mix far-right narratives with COVID-19 disinformation. So, of course, we need to worry about the production of hate speech or of misinformation content, who produces it, and how, and why. But while the business model of surveillance capitalism is intact, it really feels like the odds are stacked against us. What needs to change is not only the content, but also the space. So, how can we create digital spaces that are connecting spaces rather than drivers of division? There are so many possible answers to this question, and I can't wait to hear some of the ones that I know are coming in workshops and talks today. One that I've been thinking about lately, largely thanks to Jonathan Stray writing on the subject, is whether and how recommender algorithms could create more connection. For all my criticism of algorithms earlier, what are they serving? They're serving polarization content. I also don't think we can just do away with them. There is just so much content out there now that we need some machine-supported way to sort through it. And that's what some algorithms solve for, right? So recommenders are just algorithms that are supposed to help us navigate content and decide what to present to us. And algorithms are just opinions embedded in code, right? So recommenders just do whatever their designers think they should do. Or I really like this somebody called Stuart Russell who really neatly simplifies this. He says, like any rational entity, the algorithm learns how to modify the state of its environment, in this case, the user's mind, in order to maximize its own reward. So all the algorithm is doing is maximizing, or modifying the state of its environment, which is your mind. So if we want a user mind that engages with as much content as possible, then we will reward the recommender with more quantity of engagement, and that's all the recommender maximizes for. The fact that polarizing content is what gets that result is irrelevant. Or, in the words of someone else who writes about recommenders, Kruger, he says, "We care which means the algorithm used to solve the problem, but we only told it about the ends, so it didn't know not to cheat." And what exactly is it to cheat here? At its most simple, a recommender presents content that influences us to want to see other content, in order to predict and then optimize what we see. That might initially sound like something we don't want, but not all influence is a bad thing, right? If you forget about algorithms and instead think about your interactions with people, you know instinctively that influence can be a support to curiosity or education. But influence can also be a means to manipulate or coerce. It's hard to distinguish between this, but we can ask some questions to try to draw this line. The one I think works best is, does the interaction satisfy the needs of both the influencer and the influenced? In other words, something is influence and not manipulation when it feels more like a dialogue, more agnostic than antagonistic. Basically, when it's not a driver of conflict. So maybe the question we need to ask ourselves is whether a recommender is manipulating us. The distinction between influence and manipulation may be easy to spot in a conversation, in a book, or in a lecture. But how does it translate into code? One way some people have suggested is by building a recommender that rewards positive interactions across diverse audiences, including around diverse topics. This seems hard to do because someone would have to define what a positive interaction is and what diversity is good. Another option is to introduce some uncertainty into the predictions of the recommender, some randomness and noise in the recommendations. I like this one better because it strikes me as a way to foster complexity in a way that reflects what happens in offline interactions. I know that might seem like a long digression into one specific type of algorithm, but the reason I'm so interested in this question of recommenders is that it makes me think that we are at a turning point. We are in a time when we can still see the changes in influence and manipulation that digital spaces are having on the way we are with each other, before they become so prevalent, so embedded, that they become unseen. We're at a turning point that is the right time to be asking some important questions. How can the digital era be a time of curiosity and exploration, rather than of exclusion and ideology? What do we need to manifest now to build peace in the digital era? What social, political, and technological ideas and practices do we need to nurture? To answer these questions, we need to dream up a world that doesn't yet exist. One thing I've discovered about the Build Up team is that quite a few of us love science fiction. I wonder if the same is true with all of you, if you're all reading science fiction in your spare time. I love science fiction because it is a way of manifesting a world that is as yet unseen. One of my favorite science fiction authors is Ursula Le Guin, and she wrote that the way to see how beautiful the Earth is to see it as the moon. I love that image, the Earth as the moon, because only with distance and interval can we see beauty. And only then can our moral imagination kick in so we can manifest new ways to live together. Turning points are moments when we slow down to give space to our moral imagination so we can see what is possible. In the run-up to the conference, Anuj, who's going to be speaking in a minute, hosted online sessions that some of you I know attended. And reflecting on these sessions, he wrote that without space to slow down and reflect together on the work we do in the world, this work can easily shift into dynamics that are void of a responsibility to one another. So maybe this conference can be an interval, a space to take distance and reconsider, its own turning point of sorts. Every year at Build Peace, we have a conference slogan. It's an invitation for how to be in this space for the next few days. So our invitation this year is that together we manifest a world unseen. Thank you so much, and we're going to be hearing from Frauke now about Chemnitz.